as is the case globally, especially pertaining to emerging and developing economies, we have Kenya seeing much debate, as I said, on the high cost of living and the impact it's said to have on economic growth moving forward. Where do you sit within this debate in terms of how you see the cost of living impacting growth?
We expect to see some impact in Kenya, especially in terms of the price of fuel and the cost of food coming in. But maybe saving grace is the fact that these are traditional spikes that happen, especially when you've got low rain and also geopolitical factors that happen across the globe. And the underlying growth in terms of the cost of food and the cost of fuel, we think is not significant enough to have a big impact on the economic growth in the country. It might slow it down a bit by a few percentage points, but it's not going to be a catastrophe as far as we are concerned.
And yet we've had the Kenyan government announce last week that it was removing the tax on maize and wheat imports in a bid to cushion citizens from the effects of rising global food prices. Government also wants to remove all taxes from kerosene, which is the main fuel used for cooking and lighting houses in Kenya. So what are you making of that move? Is it a step in the right direction? Is it warranted?
It is a step in the right direction, but we don't think the impact of that will be sufficient to have a drastic impact on the cost. What we are experiencing in Kenya is inefficiencies within the supply chain for fuel, and that really needs to be sorted out for us to be able to have a significant impact on the cost of fuel. In terms of food prices, removing the import duty still leaves the cost of food coming in higher, slightly lower than the cost of food in the country. So we need internally to reduce our own production costs. And that's an area that the government really needs to focus on, especially in terms of making it possible to preserve water.
While the spotlight gets diverted that way, in the interim, we've had demands for wage increases being tabled. What are you making of the current exchange of rhetoric being had, and how do you see Kenya's private sector responding?
On Sunday, the government announced a 12.5% wage increment, which, okay, they have announced it and we have to, as a private sector, follow that. But what we need to do is to understand the long-term underlying influence on the cost of living in this country. The annualized average inflation rate is not at 12.5%, which is the headline figure at the moment. It is more like between 3 to 5%. And those are the figures we should be looking at, rather than the peaks that happen at this time of the year. So whilst the government has ordered a 12.5%, we do not expect that that will have a big impact yet. But if it does then translate into the CBAs that are going to be negotiated, then we will begin to see a negative impact on the economy, and the growth may be stifling from the expected about 6% to maybe about 4.5 to 5%. Patrick,
we've had KEPSA being quoted saying that the issue of minimum wage increases should not be politicized. It's very hard for it not to be, though, with this kind of social uprisings we've seen in many parts of the continent, many saying that it will inevitably go down that route if the situation isn't handled adequately enough. What's your view?
The issue around the cost of living, the cost of fuel and food is a global phenomenon that we are seeing across most of the countries in Africa. And yes, it can be politicized. But what we are saying is we should have open and honest and frank dialogue around why we are having such high prices. There are a lot of things that we can do as a country in terms of maintaining the prices at the level they are, rather than the peaks we are seeing. The government proposed about 2 years ago that we should have a food security policy in the country. Up to now, we have not seen anything happening around that. And really, that is what we should focus on in terms of reducing the rate of increment of the cost of living in this country.